This episode of Onward to Victory is proudly presented by our good friends at West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery at wcscreens.com. You've heard their name for years now, and for good reason. If you have needs with screen printing, embroidery, customized promotional items for your company, organization, or more, head over to wcscreens.com and get with my friend Tony and the rest of his team. They have nationwide shipping, wholesale pricing, and exemplary customer service. Not only are they big supporters of this podcast, but like you, they are also diehard fans of the Fighting Irish. Score a touchdown with wcscreens.com. And on with the show. Marching forward with part 3 of the ongoing Iconic Sites of Notre Dame series, Onward to Victory is proud to share this special episode about the Log Chapel. It's certainly one of those spots on campus that many may walk by, but also may not have a strong sense of its significance to the University of Notre Dame. So let's go ahead and remedy that today. Nestled along the shore of the St. Mary's Lake, and a short walk from some of Notre Dame's most recognizable sites, is a simple wooden chapel. Not only is this space still used for mass, weddings, and the like, but it also serves as a stark reminder of the humble origin story of Notre Dame, the humble beginnings of what would become a world-renowned university. Buckle up those chin straps, Irish fans. This is Onward to Victory. Hello, Irish fans, and welcome to Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. As always, I am humbled to be here, and my name is Alex Painter. You've made a sage decision coming here today for the 103rd episode of this humble podcast. I guarantee you're going to get some enjoyment out of it here today. We're going to talk about the Log Chapel as part 3 of the show's ongoing Iconic Sites of Notre Dame series. The Log Chapel is a popular destination for visitors, students, and alumni who may come to campus to reflect on both Notre Dame's rich history and spiritual roots. It's actually been a little while since a new installment to this mini-series was produced. Back in February 2023, the first installment was released as episode 77 with the Hesburgh Library. Some know it better as Touchdown Jesus. And in August of 2023, that same year, a second installment came in the form of episode 85, where I gave a history of the presbytery, which is directly adjacent to the grotto and the basilica, and an incredibly significant, though fairly unassuming, building in Notre Dame history. So why do such a thing as the Iconic Sites series? Well, it's because when I walk around Notre Dame's campus, and I surmise if you're here today, you are probably in a similar boat. I always strive to have as an intimate, of a connection with the structures and the stories of how they came to be and why they are significant. And I thought folks who walk around campus, take in the sites, could quite possibly pop on one of these episodes and take in some information real time. And I have the ability to actually walk around campus. As listeners know, I live in Richmond, Indiana, which is only about 140 miles from campus. So I kind of make it a point to be up there in South Bend, now let's say no fewer than 3 times a year. So I had this idea of creating a virtual campus tour, so to speak, but in podcast form. So folks who don't live as close or have access to Notre Dame like I do could potentially experience campus without actually being there. So if you're otherwise unable to make it to campus, I encourage you right now to open Google Images and maybe scroll through some photos of the Log Chapel during this episode. There are many of them, and they're Most of them are quite spectacular. A few moments here to take in the mission of this podcast and also throw out some kudos. Just as a reminder, this podcast strives to capture the enduring spirit and preserve the rich legacy of the University of Notre Dame and her football team, with a mission to create the largest and most accessible bastion of Notre Dame and Notre Dame football history. And I can't do it without you, so thanks once more for being here today, and a special thanks to our incredible partners, West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery, and also the legendary Augie's Locker Room in South Bend. Again, West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery, exemplary customer service, the gold standard of the industry. And no trip to campus is truly complete without a visit to Augie's to soak in both the history and nostalgia of Notre Dame football. So West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery and Augie's Locker Room firmly power onward to victory, and also our consensus All-Americans who support the show from a monetary standpoint. That's Brad Glazier, Will Fuller, and Andy Nickel. That support has elevated the show to what I would consider championship levels. Okay, so before we begin, let's get after it here with a quick preamble. First, where is the Log Chapel? If you situate yourself near the main quad, or the God Quad, which is right in front of the Golden Dome and right near the Basilica, just keep heading southeast until you're along the St. Mary's Lake, and you can't miss it. It sits adjacent to Bond Hall and Old College, which is likely going to be a subject of a future episode of Iconic Sites itself. But it is accentuated by the Founders Monument, which is a tall, about 20 foot tall actually, stone pedestal and statue of St. Joseph holding the child Jesus. Appropriately, the monument commemorates Father Edward Sorin, the founder of the University of Notre Dame, and the 7 brothers of the Holy Cross who arrived in South Bend in 1842, November of 1842, with Father Sorin. So I use the term appropriately because once you have made it there, you are standing on perhaps the most historic part of Notre Dame's campus. So once more, start at the Golden Dome or the main building and work your way towards the lake. You cannot miss the Log Chapel. All right, so spatially or perhaps mythically, I don't know, we are there. Second, the Log Chapel that you see today is not the original, though it was built as an identical reproduction back in 1906. The original Log Chapel burned down in 1856. So once more, the one you see today is not original. However, it does remain one of the oldest buildings on campus. Actually, after I looked it up, it's the 11th oldest structure on campus after Baden Hall, the Basilica itself, Cedar Grove Chapel, Columba Hall, Crowley Hall, LaFortune Student Center, the main building, Old College, the Presbytery, and Washington Hall. All of those of which are incredibly storied buildings on Notre Dame's campus. So again, not the original, but a hugely significant, but still hugely significant, I should say, as an exact replica and in the same location as the original. So let's start at the very beginning. The first log chapel was built in 1831, so it predated Father Sorin's arrival by over a decade. Father Stephen Baden, the first Catholic priest ordained in the United States, had purchased over 500 acres of land and decided to build a missionary site there to serve the Native Americans from the local Potawatomi tribe. He oversaw the construction of the chapel around this same time. So the chapel, which was then known as the Old Indian Chapel, was 1.5 stories high, 40 feet long, and 24 feet wide. So very diminutive. The second-story loft could also be accessed by an interior stairway. So again, a very humble operation here. But Baden soon donated his land to the Diocese of South Bend. And this land was truly one of the pioneering outposts for Catholicism in what would have been considered the quote-unquote West at the time. So there was a Belgian priest, Father Louis de Say, and he was a fellow missionary at this time with Father Baden. So Father Desai would often tramp around northern Indiana offering anointing of the sick and promoting education and spirituality among the natives. And Desai was very popular among the natives of northern Indiana, and he was noted for his kindness and his compassion. But Father Soren called Desai one of the most pivotal figures of his early life. So when Father Desai passed away in 1837, at the age of 37, it really rocked the ranks of Catholicism in America at this time. His native friends actually dug a grave in the floor and buried his body in front of the altar of the log chapel, once more then known as the Old Indian Chapel. So put a hypothetical pin into Father Desai for now, but just log that name in the back of your memory banks, because I do believe Father Stephen Baden is one that has actually got a lot of renown here in America, especially in American Catholicism, and as does Father Soren. But Father Desai was one who would prove to kind of bridge the gap between the two, and we'll hear more about Father Desai later on in this episode. So the land that was donated to the Diocese of Vincennes, where the log chapel already stood, was then given to a young French priest named Father Edward Soren to start a school in 1842. So once more, Father Soren arrived at the site and found the log chapel and a couple other ramshackle structures. After reaching South Bend from Vincennes in one of the worst winters on record in Indiana, he and his fellow Holy Cross priests were jubilant. In fact, he wrote a fellow priest, the following quote: "A few hours after our arrival in South Bend, we came to Notre Dame, where I write you these lines. Everything was frozen, yet it all appeared so beautiful. The lake particularly, with its mantle of snow, resplendently white, was to us a symbol of the stainless purity of Our Lady. We hurried about looking at the various sights, like little children, in spite of the cold. We ran from one end to the other, perfectly enchanted by the beauty of our new home." End quote. So Soren decided to name his school Notre Dame du Lac, a French phrase that translates to Our Lady of the Lake. I always like to remind people of this too, since we're talking about the log chapel and the founding of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a school that is synonymous, lockstep, with the Irish and Irish immigration and all of that. I do like to remind people that despite that, it has a very distinct French founding. Okay, so speaking of those accommodations that Father Soren was kind of alluding to, the small band of priests did indeed make their first home in that log chapel. So Father Soren occupied an 8-square-foot room on the northeast corner of the structure, and his bed consisted of 2 planks of rough wood. The rest of the brothers lived in the large room on the first floor with straw bundles as their bed. Just note, this was incredibly hard living. Father Soren wrote to one of his friends at this time, quote, "I am tempted to complain, dear friend, that our Lord sends me no other suffering than to see my dear children suffer around me, usually without the power to assist them. Lately, one of our good brothers had his foot frozen, and another one of his toes. And I had just 50 cents, not much, yet enough to permit me to show that I was not insensible to their sufferings. We have at present but one bed, and they insist that I shall take it. They themselves sleep on the floor." End quote. So that was taken from a 1906 issue of the school newspaper. And we kind of romanticize the founding of Notre Dame with art and storytelling and the like. However, let's not lose sight of the fact just how hard those first few years and beyond were. But as you look at the log chapel today, its design reflects the simplicity and the resourcefulness of the early settlers and its primitiveness. So its modest interior truly does offer a glimpse into 19th century life on the Indiana frontier. So if you've been in there, you know what I'm kind of saying. And if you haven't, again, there's lots of photographs where you can kind of see the inside of what the log chapel looks like. But it was mentioned earlier that the log chapel was about a story and a half tall, and it was very possible that the altar was actually situated in the loft, and that was where Mass was performed. So Mass being celebrated on both floors was likely, per Father Arthur Hope's history. Quote, probably the simplicity of the furnishings enabled the resident priest to switch from one floor to the other without too much difficulty, end quote. So in 1856, the old log chapel stood there. This was the original log chapel that Father Stephen Baden would have overseen construction. But at that point, a common foe of the University of Notre Dame struck, and that was fire. But believe me when I tell you, we could probably devote an entire episode of Onward to Victory to fires on campus. They had some bad ones. And I guess there has been a fire-themed episode about the Great Fire of 1879, during which the main building burned down and gave way to the current main building. The one, of course, with the Golden Dome. I say the following statement with some sensitivity to the current fires in California. But however, at the time, fires were a real threat to society because of just merely how far we've come since then in the science of fighting fires and the technological advances, again, since the 19th century. So you can likely guess where I'm going to go from here. But I am going to lean heavily into Father Hope's history here for staging. So in 1849, a terrible fire on campus had wiped out nearly all of the dwellings and left Father Soren virtually penniless. So this is 1849, 7 years after the school was founded. This was, per Hope, just 1 week after an insurance agent had offered Father Soren fire insurance, but the already cash-strapped school couldn't possibly afford it. Even worse, this was just before they were going to celebrate the consecration of a brand new church on campus, and it also went up in flames, as did the bakery, tailor shop, dormitories, the kitchen, and more. Mind you, this was just after 2 hours of fire, so that's how intense the heat was. It was awful. And once more, just as they were preparing for a joyous occasion of a new church opening. So imagine getting knocked to the mat like that. The fact that they persevered is a major nod to the school and their leader, Father Soren's, resilience. Once more, per Father Hope here, quote, this fire left an indelible impression on the priests and brothers. After that, nothing so transfixed them with fear as the cry of fire. The general use of candles and lamps and stoves was always a danger. There was no sense of security. The community lived in perpetual fear, lest they should be wiped out by fire, end quote. Somehow, the old log chapel back in 1849 was spared by this fire. But the worst part about the fires on Notre Dame's campus was typically the timing. It often feels like just when the school was starting to get some momentum, a catastrophe would happen. Fast forward 7 years now to 1856. Father Soren had just received a major planned gift from an alumni family and a $4,000 donation from a church in Toledo, Ohio. And he effectively had a plan to pay off most of the school's mounting debts in the near future. However, on December 17th, 1856, disaster once more, quote, bedeviled Soren's path, end quote. It was another fire. It started at 2 o'clock in the morning and stirred the campus out of its slumber. Now, fortunately, the wind was blowing in from the west, so the old college building was spared, but the barns, the stables, they were all engulfed, as was Father Baden's log chapel. It was quickly burned to ashes, and Father Soren himself was standing in one of the church towers directing the student, staff, and faculty's firefighting efforts. So at the time, fortunately, the church and the academic buildings were spared from the blaze, and However, the oldest structure on campus, which was 25 years old at the time, and the final piece that was reminiscent of the school's humble origins as a missionary outpost, was no more. So this is 1856. Now fast forward again to 1906, 50 years later. One might say this is where the story gets really good. So Notre Dame has a new president in Father John W. Kavanaugh. Notre Dame is in a different era. With their footing fully established, they have to worry less about the day-to-day finances, at least, and they have a steady stream of new first-time students, courtesy of the major wave of immigration in the second half of the 19th century. At any rate, some of Father Kavanaugh's first actions as president, and he took over in 1905, but in 1906, was to honor the school's past. So think about this one. In the first 6 months or so of 1906, not only was a new replica of the log chapel unveiled, but also a statue of Father Soren that sits at the head of the main quad. It's still there today. Many of you have probably taken your picture by it. But let that one sink in for a moment. That campus has been around for a very long time, and yet the statue of Father Soren and the log chapel were commemorated just mere months apart. But let's talk about that log chapel for a moment. Once more, according to Father Arthur Hope, quote, in the fall of 1905, Father Kavanaugh, together with Father John Zahm, determined to build a replica of this chapel on the site of the old one. It seemed like a simple task, but when they started to look about for an architect, it was very difficult to find one. Finally, a Negro by the name of William Arnett from Kentucky was secured for the work. He had been a slave before the Civil War and was, of course, quite an old man in 1906, but he could wield a broad axe as vigorously as a man of 50, end quote. I don't know about the rest of you, I just find it really interesting, and I had no idea that the architect of the log chapel was formerly enslaved. Wild. But by January of 1906, things were coming together. Per the January 20th, 1906 issue of the school paper, quote, the space between the logs has been filled with clay. The length of the cabin is about 45 feet, its width 25 feet, and the height of the walls 12 feet. There are 2 small windows on both sides and a door in the front. The roof is of clapboards. An ex-slave is superintending the building of the cabin, and he says he will make it look like the real old-fashioned log cabins, end quote. And if you were to look at what was ultimately produced, it looks a lot like the original log chapel. So kudos to Mr. William Arnett, whose name I feel like has been lost in campus lore, who was formerly enslaved, who actually did the deed of designing and building this thing. However, Father Kavanaugh had even grander designs for the new log chapel. He really wanted to make it a true commemoration to the school's roots. I am sure we haven't forgotten Father Stephen Baden. Again, the first on the scene where Notre Dame would come to be as a missionary, and he oversaw the construction of the first log chapel, gifted the land, essentially, for the founding of Notre Dame. So, Father Baden had passed away back in 1853 and was buried in Cincinnati, Ohio, another place he had close ties with. So, some of you from the area may know or recall there is a Baden High School in the Cincinnati area in Hamilton. But the University of Notre Dame had gotten permission to exhume Father Baden's body and to have it reinterred on Notre Dame's campus. How wildly appropriate it feels. So on May 3rd, 1906, the Founders Monument, which we talked about at the beginning of the episode with St. Joseph holding the child Jesus with the names of Father Soren and the original Brothers of the Holy Cross who came to campus, was commemorated, and the remains of Father Baden were reburied under the floor of the new log chapel. I think campus historian Dorothy Corson may have said it best when she wrote, quote, accordingly, The afternoon of May 3rd, 1906, Notre Dame witnessed one of the most striking cases of poetic justice to be found in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, when Father Baden was given his little log house, which is at the same time the house of God on the banks of St. Mary's Lake, where he might rest in peace. End quote. That's pretty cool. But we don't end there. So on November 20th, 1925, the day before his boys were to take on Northwestern. So 1925, we're fast forwarding once more about 2 decades from when Father Baden was laid to rest in the new log chapel. But none other than Irish head coach Knute Rockne was baptized and formally converted to Catholicism in the log chapel. The next morning, he went on to receive his first communion, once more at the log chapel. His team went on to beat Northwestern that day 13-10. So for you big-time Notre Dame football buffs, you could look at the log chapel and point and say that's where Knute Rockne converted to Catholicism, right there in 1925. This is significant because just 1 year earlier, in 1924, of course, his team won a national championship, buoyed by the Four Horsemen, who we've talked about at length this past year. But they did so while also coming under fire by the Ku Klux Klan, who came in and effectively overran South Bend in the spring-summer of 1924. So he converted to Catholicism when it really wasn't in vogue to do so. And do you remember Father Louis Desaye, the popular priest who had succeeded Father Baden in South Bend as a missionary? Well, as you may recall from earlier in the episode, he passed away in 1837, and he was buried beneath the floor of the original log chapel. So in 1848, 11 years after his death, Father Edward Sorin actually had Desaye move to a crypt in the basement of the church, which would eventually become the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. So in 1987, which to firmly plant our boots in history, this would be the final year of the presidency of Father Ted Hesburgh. The remains of Father Desaye, along with 2 other early priests who were buried in the lower floor of the basilica, were reinterred with Father Baden in the log chapel. So along with Father Desaye, Father Benjamin Petit, who actually succeeded Desaye as missionary in the area, was buried with Father Baden, along with Father Francois Cointet, who arrived at Notre Dame in 1843, 1 year after the school's founding, and was a close friend of Father Sorin. So all 4 of these very early priests, both in the area pre-founding of Notre Dame and post-founding of Notre Dame, have found their final resting place in the log chapel. So now you know the story behind that. I hope the next time you're on campus or scrolling through pictures on your phone, looking up the log chapel on the internet, this episode will help you understand its significance and appreciate it as a symbol, as one of the greatest underdog stories in higher education, the University of Notre Dame. While researching and writing this episode, I found a message that was delivered by Father Ted Hesburgh, again, longtime president of the college, in 1986 to the faculty of the university. So 1986, his career as president was winding down, but 2 things he said stuck out to me. He said, quote, "Institutional memory is a powerful force, so often neglected in our day," end quote. And the other was, quote, "My only concern is that having come thus far from that log chapel by the frozen lake to all one sees all around us today, that we might become complacent and self-satisfied. That would signal the end of the great dream," end quote. So as I conclude this episode on Notre Dame's historic log chapel, we're reminded of the profound importance of institutional memory. In the words of the wise observer, institutional memory is a powerful force, so often neglected in our day. The log chapel stands as a testament to Notre Dame's humble beginnings. A frozen lake and a dream setting the foundation for what has become a world-renowned university and a powerhouse in college football. The log chapel is more than an old structure, honoring an even older structure. It is the core of Notre Dame. Yet as we honor this legacy, we heed the caution once more, having come this far from that log chapel by the frozen lake to all that we see around us today, we must guard against complacency and self-satisfaction, because that would signal the end of the great dream. Notre Dame's story is indeed about remembering the past, and it's about using that memory to inspire a future worthy of its origins. So I suppose at this point I've got a fair amount of moxie about the importance of this topic, the old log chapel, but I do hope you enjoyed this presentation. And if you did, let me know. Email me at onwardtovictorypodcast@gmail.com or connect with me on Facebook. Listen, share, like, all the above. That's how this show continues to grow in its now 6th year of existence. But in the interim, I had better sign off. This has been Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. And in kindness, I am your host, Alex Painter. And as always, go Irish.